If you've seen any of my historical videos on any of my channels, then you may have heard me talk about private detective agencies. While some still exist, they used to be far more popular and far more controversial. While in the mid-19th century, the United States was a patchwork of rapidly growing cities, expanding frontiers, and budding industrial centers. The federal government was small, and most law enforcement was handled by local sheriffs whose authority often ended at county lines. Criminals exploited these jurisdictional gaps, while counterfeiters circulated forged bills that destabilized local economies. If law enforcement agencies aren't talking to each other, then it's easy to get away with a lot. In the years before the police were a professional public institution, and before federal agencies like the FBI dominated criminal investigations, there was another force that kept the sleepless hours and watched over rail lines, banks, and presidents. That force carried a stark motto: "We never sleep," and its very name inspired both reassurance and dread. This was the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, or if you've played Red Dead Redemption 2, the guys who were trying to stop the Vanderlyn gang. Alan Pinkerton, a Scottish immigrant and cooper by trade, saw an opportunity in this lawless environment. Having fled Scotland, Pinkerton arrived in Illinois with a conviction that self-reliance and vigilance were necessary for survival. He lived near Chicago, working with abolitionist leaders and even offering his home as a stop on the Underground Railroad. And in 1847, an accidental discovery changed his life. While gathering wood on an island in the Fox River, he stumbled upon a camp of counterfeiters. Alerting the local sheriff and helping to capture the gang, he realized that an individual could make a difference where official authorities faltered. This early experience inspired Pinkerton to formalize his detective work. In 1850, he partnered with attorney Edward Rucker to create the Northwest Police Agency, which soon rebranded as the Pinkertons National Detective Agency. Their mission was simple but ambitious: provide professional investigative services wherever local law enforcement was ineffective or non-existent. The agency offered surveillance, undercover work, and armed guards to banks and railroads, operating across state lines and emphasizing a moral code that forbade agents from inducing crime. Its emblem, an unblinking eye accompanied by the motto, "We never sleep," was both an advertisement and a warning. In fact, this phrase would later give rise to the term private eye, cementing the Pinkertons in popular culture, as well as becoming what armchair detectives would call themselves when deciphering a true crime documentary case. But the agency did more than inspire language. It collected the world's largest repository of criminal records in the 19th century. It also standardized detective work and helped shape modern policing methods. The agency's history reads like a sweeping panorama. A series of detective stories, spy plots, labor laws, and public scandals all rolled into one of the most impactful and controversial institutions of all of law history. And that's a history that we're going to be talking about today. So hello everyone, today we're talking about the story of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Pinkertons are something that a lot of us have probably heard of before, or at least heard of a private investigator. But I'm sure a lot of us don't know where that story comes from, and why it was so controversial that we don't see a lot of it anymore, as well as changes in federal law enforcement that made the practice less favorable. But it's such a unique and interesting part of American history that I don't want it to be one that we forget about. So if that sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about the highs and lows of America's first private law enforcement agency. Mother's Day is just around the corner, and for the first year I have to get a gift for my mom and my wife. And I know my wife likes to listen to podcasts and music while she's in the house, but she doesn't like wearing earbuds because she doesn't like something constantly in her ear. Well, now I've got the perfect gift thanks to today's sponsor, Raycon Earbuds, and their new Essential Open Earbuds design. See, rather than your typical earbud, the open earbud sets in front of your ear instead of inside of it, hooking around the top of your ear and resting over top of your ear canal. So now you get the full benefit of an earbud in your ear without actually having anything in there that would block outside noise. So now someone calling your name, a car honking, running into someone while out on a jog can all be heard. And the sound quality is high enough that it doesn't lessen any of the things you want to listen to. It's the best of both worlds, and the hook part rotates and is flexible around the top of your ear so it always stays in. Unless you want these things to come out, they're not coming off until you take them off. I think I just cracked my neck, but the earbud's still in. Plus, Raycons are half the price of their competitors, and if you don't like them, you have a 30-day guarantee. So you can try them out and see if they're right for you free of risk. I wear mine when I'm working outside or running on the treadmill or wrecking my dirt bike. And I'm sure my wife will use hers on her way to work or when she's playing Fortnite on the computer, because she does that a lot. That's another thing. Raycon earbuds have multi-point connection, so you can connect to several different Bluetooth devices and you don't have to reconnect when you want to switch from one to the other. Plus, they have 8 hours of playtime on their battery and 36 hours of battery with their charging case. So even if you use them a ton, you're probably not going to charge them more than once a week. It's an easy step to make your life and the mother in your life a little bit better. So celebrate the moms in your life and click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/WendiGangOpen to get 15% off the Essential Open Earbuds. That's right, 15% off the Essential Open Earbuds. Like I said, they got a 30-day money-back guarantee, so why not? Again, that's go to buyraycon.com/WendiGangOpen to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you to Raycon for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description, and we are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So, to appreciate why Alan Pinkerton became such a formidable figure, we have to understand the world he left behind and the one he entered. Born in Glasgow in 1819, Alan grew up in a family that experienced both political turmoil and personal tragedy. His father, William Pinkerton, a police sergeant, died during a demonstration advocating for universal male voting and broader political rights for the working class. The Chartists, as they were called, were feared by the British establishment. Protests were met with repression, and activists faced arrest. In a twist of fate, Alan himself was rumored to have been a government informant, though the evidence for this is ambiguous. Whether he left Scotland because he was wanted by the government for being a Chartist, or if the rumors were true or believed to be true and his fellow activists no longer trusted him, either way, his immigration in 1842 was a turning point in his life. Alan carried with him both the trauma of witnessing state violence and a willingness to challenge authority. These experiences would compound and inform his commitment to law enforcement and his readiness to operate outside government structures when he deemed it necessary. Settling near Chicago, Alan Pinkerton found himself in a boomtown built on railroads and commerce. With no national currency, residents relied on privately issued banknotes known as wildcat money, a haphazard medium of exchange that was easy to forge. If there's no universal currency and the towns are deciding their own currency, well, who's to say I don't show up and suddenly have a bunch of my own? To support his family, he worked as a cooper, which is a skilled craftsperson who made and repaired wooden barrels and casks. The trade took him into the countryside for timber and into markets where he saw the confusion that these proprietary currencies caused. But more on that later. Alan's connections with abolitionists not only led him to quietly convert his cooper shop into a stop on the Underground Railroad, but also taught him how to operate with discretion. Those lessons proved invaluable when later, in 1847, he ventured onto an island in the Fox River to collect timber and came across a camp of counterfeiters. He watched their operation, notified the sheriff, and helped plan the raid. The resulting arrest earned him a deputy sheriff's post in Kane County and brought him into contact with businessmen who would soon hire him to investigate other crimes. By 1850, Alan Pinkerton and Chicago attorney Edward Rucker formalized their collaboration under the banner of the Northwest Police Agency. Their detectives did more than catch counterfeiters. They also served as armed guards for the railroads and banks, two crucial entities for connecting a young and developing nation. People need to get somewhere and they need to have money when they get there. Among the Pinkertons' early clients was the Adams Express Company, a private courier service that ferried cash and parcels by stagecoach and rail across vast distances. This meant they were moving large sums of money through remote depots and isolated tracks, so it helps to have guards with you. Keeping those shipments safe demanded more than a lone bank clerk, so Adams Express turned to Pinkerton's men for protection and investigative muscle. In this way, the agency's business model married crime fighting with corporate security, laying the groundwork for an enterprise that would soon expand nationwide. At first, Alan offered consistent fee structures and insisted on meticulous record keeping. This prevented the corruption associated with reward-based thief-takers, or bounty hunters. Because of this, detectives for the agency were paid at a per-day rate rather than for collecting bounties, eliminating incentives to fabricate crimes. Around this time, it wasn't uncommon for bounty hunters to commit crimes and then blame them on someone else, or to have a fall guy commit a small crime who eventually the reward money will be split with. But since the Pinkertons were paid by the day, well, that meant there was no incentive to keep this con going. Pinkerton also crafted a strict code of conduct. Agents had to possess spotless reputations, refrain from inducing crimes, and avoid entrapment. This emphasis on professionalism distinguished the agency from disreputable detectives and earned it contracts that expanded its reach beyond Illinois. By the early 1860s, Allen's detectives were traversing the country by rail and horseback to investigate crimes, protect property, and gather intelligence. One key to the agency's success was Allen's obsession with record keeping. He built one of the earliest centralized files on criminals, an unprecedented collection of mugshots, physical descriptions, and dossiers that his detectives could consult across jurisdictions. In an era before fingerprinting or standardized police records, such a resource was revolutionary. Or unless someone recognized you, you could just go to the next town over and have a spotless reputation. This strategy demonstrated Allen's foresight. He understood that data was power, and that controlling information meant controlling narratives. The trove not only helped his agents recognize and apprehend repeat offenders, but it became a selling point when courting clients. Pinkerton could argue that his detectives were better informed than the local sheriffs, which made them more effective. That reputation for thoroughness drew high-profile contracts and placed the agency at the center of some of the most dramatic events in U.S. history. But Allen Pinkerton was as much a public relations strategist as he was a detective. He understood that clients would entrust their secrets and money only to a brand that they perceived as professional, trustworthy, and relentless. To cultivate that brand, Allen embarked on a publishing spree. Between 1875 and 1884, he released 17 storybooks. Each volume featured the agency's logo of the wide-awake eye and the slogan, "We Never Sleep," reinforcing brand recognition. The stories inside were a blend of fact and fiction, depicting Pinkerton detectives as resourceful heroes who anticipated criminals' every move. One chapter, for instance, might describe the delicate art of stealing from hotel guests without waking them. Another might detail how pickpockets would clean out wallets and then return them so victims remained unaware. These anecdotes served a dual purpose. They entertained readers and also showcased the craft of detection, thereby legitimizing Pinkerton's claimed expertise. Almost like Dr. John Watson writing about his adventures with Sherlock Holmes. The stories presented his detectives as resourceful heroes, always one step ahead of criminals. And having the heroes of the story be Pinkertons, and the Pinkerton agency publishing the books themselves, everything you read about comes from them and reinforces the idea that they can stop these things. Yet Allen used those very books to argue the opposite. In prefaces and asides, he scolded, quote, unthinking people for believing that detectives possess supernatural powers and insisted that real success came from patient observation and, quote, clean, healthy, honest methods. That tension, feeding the appetite for sensational tales while demystifying the work, was deliberate. By acknowledging the popular superstition and then disavowing it, Allen positioned his firm as uniquely qualified, exceptional enough to stop any criminal, but grounded enough to be trusted. If the books maintained that the Pinkertons were just a step above the rest and they had a supernatural ability to stop crime, well then legitimate clients probably wouldn't be interested because he sounds like a snake oil salesman. But if the Pinkertons emphasize that they're nothing special, they're just good at their job, well that's the kind of client that a business could trust. And this strategy worked. His books simultaneously advertised his agency and shaped public perception of the detectives, and his name became synonymous with private detection, as competitors rushed to imitate his branding tactics. Another important aspect of Pinkerton's marketing was the way he presented gender roles in espionage. He famously employed Kate Warren, widely considered to be the first female private detective in the United States. In his writings, Allen highlighted the unique advantage female operatives possessed. They could feign distress to distract male targets, gain access to households under the guise of domestic work, and slip under the radar of those who underestimated women. Now, while Allen also expressed concerns about women becoming morphine addicts, something that in retrospect is kind of funny, his decision to employ and promote female detectives broadened public understanding of who could be a spy and how intelligence work could be conducted. Allen's inclusion of Warren's exploits in his books served to not only be a new outlook on women in unconventional workplace roles, but also as another selling point. His agency was innovative enough to harness the talents of people who would otherwise be ignored. In due time, Allen's skill at crafting compelling stories would intersect with national history in ways that blurred the lines between fact and fiction, which we'll get to shortly. All of this talk of detective books and controlling the narrative can be fun when we're all having fun, but not so fun when it becomes propaganda. The outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 was a crucible for the young detective agency. Rumors of secessionist plots and fears for the president-elect Abraham Lincoln's safety thrust Allen onto the national stage. According to his own account, Allen uncovered the Baltimore Plot, which was an alleged conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln as he traveled to his inauguration. Acting on intelligence gathered by Allen and Kate Warren, Lincoln's travel itinerary was altered, and he passed through Baltimore incognito. Warren, disguised as someone named Mrs. Cherry and Mrs. Barley, infiltrated secessionist circles and learned that the agents intended to kill Lincoln as he changed trains. So she purchased 4 sleeping car tickets and accompanied Allen and Lincoln to an overnight journey, pretending to tend to an ill brother. Throughout the trip, Warren remained alert, a living embodiment of the agency's promise that its eyes never closed. Or at least, as claimed by Allen Pinkerton. See, this daring rescue to save Abraham Lincoln's life became a part of Allen Pinkerton's lore, but historians have long debated its legitimacy. Skeptics like Ward Hill Lemon, law enforcement officer and personal bodyguard to Abraham Lincoln, accused Allen of exaggerating fragments of truth in order to get closer with the president. Lemon claimed no arrests were made and suggested that Allen had conjured a dreadful plot. According to Lemon, the president later regretted the clandestine trip through Baltimore, believing he had fled a phantom threat. If you have a detective agency and you want to get close to the president, well, saying that you found a plot to kill the president and you'll keep him safe is a pretty good way to do that. However, if this was indeed true, eventually, Lincoln at the time certainly did not feel that way. Following the Baltimore trip, Lincoln hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to organize a secret service for obtaining military intelligence on the Confederacy and sometimes to act as his bodyguards. These efforts predated the official establishment of the United States Secret Service in 1865 and laid the groundwork for modern protective services. So modern bodyguard systems and the United States Secret Service are based on Lincoln hiring the Pinkertons. During the Civil War, Allen Pinkerton adopted the alias Major E.J. Allen and worked closely with Union General George McClellan. His agents infiltrated Western Virginia and Kentucky, gauging sentiments and estimating troop strengths. When McClellan took command of the Army of the Potomac, Allen followed him to Washington, D.C., where he surveilled potential Confederate sympathizers among the capital's social elite. One notorious case involved Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a well-connected socialite who entertained prominent politicians and passed information to Confederate authorities. Allen placed her under house arrest and later jailed her in the old Capitol prison. Greenhow was eventually convicted of espionage and deported to Richmond, which is such a weird sentence to say. During the Civil War, Virginia was effectively another country, so this person got deported to Virginia. Truly, a fate worse than death. While these operations elevated Allen's stature, they also exemplified the blurred lines between legal prosecution and wartime repression. Operating as a private agency with quasi-governmental authority, the Pinkerton Agency conducted surveillance, arrests, and interrogations without clear oversight. The Civil War also further showcased Allen's penchant for public relations. A photograph taken at Antietam in October of 1862 captures President Lincoln standing alongside Allen and General John A. McClernand. This image symbolized the agency's integration into national affairs and became a fixture in Pinkerton offices. Allen sent copies of the photograph to prospective clients to emphasize his proximity to power. He also boasted that he had both made his reputation and earned substantial profits during the war. I mean, if you're trying to market yourself as an agency that can be trusted and that has the authority to act on the behalf of the law, then you can understand why taking a picture of yourself with the president and a general, because you are now the president's personal bodyguard and the guy he hires to keep him safe, would be effective. The war experience validated private detectives as valuable assets to the state and provided financial resources, a cachet, that would fuel the agency's post-war expansion. Yet the same qualities that made the Pinkerton Agency so effective in wartime things like autonomy, secrecy, and readiness to use force, would later make them a source of great controversy. After the Civil War, the nation's attention shifted westward. The railroads continued to expand, and the vast territories of the American West became both an economic frontier and a refuge for lawless gangs. I mean, the country was having trouble policing things in the East. If you were out west where the railroads hadn't made it yet, you could get away with anything. With local law enforcement stretched thin, banks and express companies turned to the Pinkerton agency to protect their assets and pursue criminals across state lines. With the agency specializing in tracking train robbers and stagecoach bandits, the Pinkertons were essentially acting as bounty hunters for corporate clients. One early challenge came from the Reno Gang of Indiana, pioneers of train robbery in the United States. They targeted the Adams Express Company, who promptly hired Allen's detectives to recover its losses and punish the offenders. Almost effortlessly, the Pinkerton agency captured John Reno and secured his conviction. But as they pursued other members, masked vigilantes intervened by taking the law into their own hands. In one instance, a vigilante committee seized 3 captured gang members from Pinkerton agents and hung them, had them hung, whatever. Later, a special train full of masked men arrived at a jail, shot the jailer, and hung the remaining Reno brothers, cutting telegraph lines to prevent news from spreading. Allen's own son justified the lynchings by saying locals were terrorized and eager to eradicate the gang. I mean, people were terrorized by the gang, so the Pinkertons show up to arrest the members. But to communities that had a personal vendetta against the gang members, well, maybe jailing them wasn't enough. So maybe you just bust those guys out of jail so you can kill them yourself. These events underscored the chaotic blend of private and mob justice on the frontier. Pinkerton agents captured criminals, but community members often circumvented the legal process, leading to summary executions. As the agency grew in scale, it operated in a moral gray zone, where its pursuits of justice sometimes collided with local vigilantism and the absence of due process. However, no outlaw tested Allen's resolve quite like the chase for the infamous Jesse James and his associates. By the early 1870s, Jesse and Frank James had achieved a Robin Hood mystique in Missouri, robbing banks and trains and evading capture. When the gang robbed a train at Gads Hill in 1874, Adams Express Company once again turned to the Pinkertons. Pinkerton detective Joseph Weicher attempted to infiltrate the James household disguised as a farmhand, but he was eventually discovered, as was his body shortly thereafter. Pinkerton operatives were then ambushed on a country road, resulting in a gunfight that killed a Pinkerton agent, a local official, and gang member John Younger. As you could imagine, these losses enraged Allen. Pinkerton wrote to his staff that blood had been spilled and that the gang must die. Even after the express company withdrew its contract, Allen vowed to continue the hunt as a personal mission. The climactic event came in January of 1875, when Pinkerton agents surrounded the James family homestead at night. That night, the agents tossed a specially designed incendiary device intended to illuminate the house and frighten the occupants into surrender. Think of it like an 1800s version of a flashbang. Instead, when it came through the window, the family pushed the device into the fireplace, where it exploded. This explosion killed the Jameses boys' younger half-brother and blew off the arm of their mother, Zerelda Samuels. Unfortunately for Allen, Jesse and Frank weren't even in the house. So you had the James brothers, who were outlaws but had this mythic persona around them, and then the Pinkertons, fueled by personal revenge, go to their house and end up killing a young boy and blowing off the arm of an innocent woman, only for it to be revealed that the people they were looking for weren't even there. Public outrage, naturally, erupted like a volcano. What was supposed to be a precise arrest turned into a brutal, bungled raid that maimed innocents and galvanized sympathy for the outlaws. Newspapers condemned Pinkerton's heavy-handedness, and residents of Missouri who already resented corporate power rallied behind the James gang. Allen withdrew from the vendetta, and Jesse James would not be killed until 7 years later in 1882, when a member of his own gang betrayed him. If that wasn't enough, Allen's pursuit of Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch in the 1890s also revealed the thin balancing act between persistence and overreach. Detective Charlie Siringo spent years tracking Cassidy and his gang, forcing them into constant motion. The agency collected rare photographs of gang associates like at a place, showing a sophisticated intelligence network that rivaled government services. But Cassidy ultimately escaped to South America, eluding capture. The Wild Bunch remained charismatic rebels in the imagination of the public, while Pinkerton agents were seen as relentless, often unfair, pursuers. Needless to say, the general public's view of the agency in the West was, at this point, mixed at best. Law-abiding citizens and clients praised the Pinkertons for bringing order and retrieving stolen property. Yet many in the frontier community saw outlaws as folk heroes who defended local honor against distant corporate interests. Pinkerton agents were often labeled as paid assassins and tools of the railroads. This dichotomy, heroes to some, villains to others, would only intensify even more when the agency turned its focus from chasing criminals to suppressing labor movements. Wow, would you look at this? Something that started with the best intentions would then turn to corruption. It is as if there is a paved road with intentions, and I can't remember where the road goes that is paved with good intentions, but I'm sure it's somewhere good and not bad. Right. The Industrial Revolution transformed the United States in the late 19th century. Factories multiplied, railroads crisscrossed the continent, and heavy industry reshaped urban landscapes. With these developments came new social conflicts like long hours, dangerous conditions, and exploitative wage systems. In the coal fields of Pennsylvania, many miners were immigrants who faced discrimination. These workers were often paid in company scrip, redeemable only at company stores, effectively binding them to their employers. I mean, you work for years of your life and get paid in monopoly money that you can only cash in at the monopoly store. So if you want to find a job somewhere else, good luck starting over. Wives feared daily for their husband's safety, and there were instances of bodies returned to families without ceremony. Laborers began to organize, forming unions and secret societies to demand better conditions. Industrialists, fearing lost profits and sabotage, searched for ways to undermine these movements. The Pinkerton Agency, with its reputation for infiltration and force, became the go-to instrument for corporations seeking to control their workforce. One of the earliest and most notorious interventions involved the Molly Maguires. The Mollies were not just a shadowy club in the hills, but a loose coalition of Irish immigrant miners and their supporters. Many had fled the Great Famine and British oppression, only to find themselves in Pennsylvania company towns where the mines paid them in scrip, leased them cramped housing, and left their families perpetually indebted. Discriminated against for being Irish and Catholic, they sometimes responded to dangerous working conditions and exploitation by sending threatening letters to foremen and, in a handful of cases, by carrying out acts of violence. Local elites christened this resistance as the Molly Maguires, borrowing a name that originally came from secret societies in Ireland. Allen assumed that the American Molly Maguires were an extension of Irish secret societies, though the label may have been a convenient catch-all for crimes and conspiracies. So to infiltrate this hidden world, Allen deployed James McParland, who adopted the alias of James McKenna and embedded himself in mining communities from 1873 to 1876. McParland attended union meetings, observed rituals, and built relationships, all while reporting back to his handlers. His assignment culminated in 20 miners being arrested and executed for murder and conspiracy. But the Molly Maguire operation reveals the ethical complexities of Pinkerton methods. According to critics, McParland provoked or allowed violence to occur to strengthen the case against his targets. During his assignment, the number of threats, usually in the form of letters to mine bosses allegedly signed by the Mollies, experienced a sudden spike. Obviously, if the undercover guy shows up and then the group gets really violent, this raised suspicion that some of them had been staged. This infiltration also bled into extrajudicial violence. In August of 1875, Allen wrote to his superintendent urging the formation of a vigilante committee to take, quote, fearful revenge on the Mollies. In December of that year, a vigilante raid occurred at Wiggins Patch. 30 masked men, acting on intelligence from McParland, attacked the home of James and Charles O'Donnell, pistol whipping their mother and shooting their sister. McParland, being the undercover agent who gave this information, was outraged that women were harmed, but felt that male victims, quote, got there just deserving. The violence set the stage for a series of trials that were, by any fair measure, a travesty. An attorney named Franklin Gowen and other coal company lawyers prosecuted the case themselves. The state supplied only the courtroom and the gallows, so the entire trial was being held by the coal companies who these people were acting against. allegedly. Many of the 20 miners who were hanged were convicted on the strength of McPartland's testimony alone, with little or no independent defense. Judge John P. Lavelle later called the proceedings a, quote, surrender of state sovereignty, noting that a private corporation had investigated, arrested, and essentially prosecuted its own employees. While the industrialists celebrated the suppression of the Mollies as a triumph of law and order, many labor advocates and Irish Americans saw it as an industry-backed frame-up. They argued that Pinkerton agents acted as provocateurs who fabricated or encouraged crimes to justify their presence. They noted that violence attributed to the Mollies escalated only after McParland arrived. These accusations remained largely confined to local circles, and the broader public was slow to sympathize. Nevertheless, the operation proved a template for how Pinkertons would engage with labor conflicts. Emboldened by success and spurred by profit, the agency expanded its union infiltration and strike-breaking activities throughout the 1880s. The list of strikes involving Pinkertons reads like a chronicle of the labor movement. In 1884, the Hocking Valley Strike erupted in Ohio when coal miners protested wage cuts. Pinkerton guards were hired to protect company property and ensure that replacement workers could continue operations. Clashes ensued, resulting in the destruction of property and injuries. That same year, Alan Pinkerton died unceremoniously after slipping on wet pavement and biting his tongue, which led to gangrene. That's right, the head of the Pinkerton agency died because he bit his tongue when he fell. His death was both mundane and ironic. A man who survived political uprisings, treacherous outlaws, and wartime espionage succumbed to an everyday accident. In 1885, the agency became embroiled in the McCormick Reaper strike in Chicago. As Pinkerton men approached the factory, bystanders jeered at them. The agents responded by firing into the crowd, killing several people. Though 4 Pinkerton men were indicted, prosecutors declined to pursue the case. The violence escalated in subsequent years. In 1886, during a railway strike at the Lakeshore Railroad, guards hired by the Pinkertons, similar to the year before, fired into a crowd, killing a protester. It happened again a month later, during a stockyard strike, this time killing a bystander. Despite eyewitness testimony, the grand jury failed to indict the agents. In 1887, the United Labor Party issued a statement condemning the agency as a wandering band of murderers. Labor leader Terence Powderly decried Pinkerton men as outcasts from society, hired assassins devoid of decency. He argued that industrialists employed them because they lacked faith in their own managerial abilities, preferring to outsource, quote, delicate and important work to human brutes. Powderly further contended that the existence of the agency depended on creating fear among the wealthy, that without conjuring threats, the Pinkertons would have no purpose. While the leader of the Labor Party would undoubtedly carry some biases, Powderly was not alone. The Nation magazine declared that the appearance of Pinkerton men in any civilized country would fill the population with shame. It described the agency as a band of mercenaries and a sign of social regression, likening them to medieval barbarism. By 1888, the term Pinkerton had become shorthand for any armed guard or vigilant group employed by American industrialists. The agency's armed presence in labor disputes was so common that Pinkerton men were equated with strikebreakers in general. Critics argued that the agency's success in infiltrating and suppressing unions depended on fabricating conspiracies and instigating violence. It was common belief that if the Pinkertons investigate someone, there will be arrests and executions, because if they aren't doing crime naturally, the Pinkerton agent will just make up crimes that they're doing or get them to commit a crime that they can then convict them for. In essence, the Pinkertons became a private army available to those with the means to hire them. This escalated labor conflicts and undermined trust in law enforcement. This incendiary environment set the stage for the most infamous confrontation in the agency's history: the Homestead Strike. The Homestead Strike of 1892 stands as a watershed moment in both labor history and the history of the Pinkertons. The strike erupted at the Homestead Steel Works in Pennsylvania, owned by Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel Company. Carnegie, often depicted as a philanthropist and industrial visionary, left day-to-day management in the hands of Henry Clay Frick, a hardline executive known for his tough stance on unions. The workers were members of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the strongest trade unions of the time. Negotiations over wages and working conditions broke down, and Frick decided to force the issue. He erected a 12-foot fence around the mill, complete with rifle loopholes, water mains capable of blasting scalding water, and electrified wires. Workers dubbed the fortified factory Fort Frick, a name that signified both their resentment and their recognition that they were facing a military-style operation. Behind the scenes, Frick secretly negotiated with the Pinkerton agency to hire 300 armed guards. He intended to break the union by reopening the plant with replacement workers. And on July 6, 1892, 2 barges carrying Pinkerton men approached the mill via the Monongahela River. Strikers had been watching the river and were prepared, and when the barges arrived, a confrontation ensued. And by confrontation, I mean a gunfight. The crowd on the shore traded shots with men aboard the ship and vice versa. After 14 hours of fighting at Homestead, the Pinkerton agents, trapped on their barges, hoisted a white flag. The crowd refused at first, but eventually a Union leader negotiated a surrender. The agents were disarmed, marched through the town, and forced to run a gauntlet of jeering residents who bested them. The battle left 9 strikers and 3 Pinkertons dead, and nearly every agent wounded. The strikers cheered at this, but you could imagine how the state of Pennsylvania felt about this. The strikers' victory was short-lived. Within days, Pennsylvania's governor ordered the state militia to Homestead. The troops escorted locked train cars of replacement workers into the mill, and the strike dragged on for 4 months before collapsing. The workers returned without union representation. Homestead's defeat showed that even a strong union could be broken when private force and state intervention combined. Public reaction to the Homestead confrontation was intense. Newspapers questioned the morality of hiring a private army, and the New York Times investigation alleged that the Pinkerton Reserves were recruited from petty criminals compelled to serve as strikebreakers. The image of armed barges and a militarized factory ignited a national debate about the role of private security in labor disputes. Within a few years, public opinion shifted. What had been seen as a moral force protecting society became a despised tool of capital. Sure, a lot of the problems people had with working conditions came down to the industries that were hiring them and enacting these conditions and the state that allowed them to carry on like this. But the Pinkertons were always the arm that the state and the industry would use, so they got a lot of the hate, as you could imagine. Unionists seized the moment to condemn the agency. At Senate hearings on labor violence, workers testified that the English language was, quote, inadequate to express the hate that they felt towards Pinkerton detectives. One skilled worker called the hiring of Pinkertons, quote, an unjust and unlawful way of forcing us into submission. Yet the hearings also gave space to industrialists to explain why they turned to the agency. In the eyes of Henry Clay Frick, local law enforcement could not protect the property or the non-union workers he planned to hire, and he believed he had a right to keep the mill running. Robert Pinkerton himself, son of Alan Pinkerton, testified that his men were simply hired to maintain order and defend property, but his defense could not stem the tide of public condemnation. I mean, people are mad that your people shot at strikers who wanted better working conditions. It's not a good idea to be like, well, think of the money. I mean, we were trying to protect the company. Isn't that what we all want? The fallout from Homestead reached the halls of Congress. A House committee investigated, taking testimony from law enforcement officials, capitalists, and workers. Their final report concluded that the Pinkertons had grown into a private military force under the control of whoever could afford their services. The committee recommended restoring state authority over labor conflicts, rather than relying on private interests. In other words, when these issues arise in the future, the state should decide what happens, rather than the company just hiring a bunch of bullies to make everyone quit. As a direct response, Congress passed the Anti-Pinkerton Act in 1893, prohibiting the federal government from hiring employees of private detective agencies like Pinkerton. 23 states enacted similar laws. The act didn't shut down Pinkerton, but it curtailed the agent's federal work and signaled that policing belonged to the public. After Homestead, many factory owners tried to head off labor unrest by tinkering with their own operations. Some embraced scientific management, measuring every motion on the shop floor and training employees to follow the one best way to do a job, believing that efficiency and fair pay would diffuse grievances. Others turned to benevolent industrialism, building paternalistic company towns like Pullman, Illinois, where brick houses, parks, and sanitary facilities were meant to create loyalty. Pullman promised to eliminate conflict through careful planning and uplift, but when wages were cut and rent stayed high, the the workers struck in 1894. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to suppress it, resulting in more fatalities. The pattern of violence followed by state intervention persisted, and the Pinkertons became symbols of an era when private force was used to confront public dissent. I have an entire video on the main channel about one of the most famous strikes in American history, the Battle of Blair Mountain. The private agency involved there wasn't the Pinkertons, but it's certainly their ramifications. Issues like this existed outside of the Pinkerton agency. Pinkertons were just the ones to do it first, and therefore the ones whose names are most associated. The Homestead disaster and the Anti-Pinkerton Act marked a new turn of the tide, and in the 20th century, the agency faced a changing environment. Local and state police forces professionalized, adopting techniques such as centralized record keeping and interstate communication that Pinkerton had pioneered. In 1908, the federal government established the Bureau of Investigation, later known, of course, as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, to conduct national law enforcement. The creation of the FBI reduced the government's reliance on private detectives, while signaling an ideological shift. Law enforcement was to be a public good managed by accountable agencies, not to serve the interest of whoever has the most money. That's still what it does a lot in reality, but that's not what's on the label anymore. Additionally, the Anti-Pinkerton Act restricted the agency's ability to secure federal contracts, which had been profitable during the Civil War. The combination of legal constraints and improved public policing diminished the agency's central role. The decline in violent strike-breaking did not mean an immediate end to Pinkerton's involvement in labor conflicts. In the 1930s, Senator Robert La Follette launched an investigation into the use of private detectives as labor spies. Robert Pinkerton II, Allen's great-grandson and then president of the agency, testified in 1936 that companies had paid the agency $1.75 million for espionage services since 1933. In other words, companies were paying the Pinkertons a lot of money to act as spies in their own workforce. He admitted that Pinkerton operatives were embedded in practically every major union: 5 in the United Mine Workers, 9 in the United Rubber Workers, 17 in the United Textile Workers, and 55 in the United Auto Workers. The agency even spied on the Assistant Secretary of Labor during a 1935 strike. These revelations embarrassed the Pinkertons, and in 1937, the company vowed to end its labor investigations. By then, the political climate had shifted. The Wagner Act had granted workers the right to unionize, and public opinion favored collective bargaining. Violent strike-breaking was no longer acceptable. Courts and federal agencies intervened instead, using injunctions and arbitration to resolve disputes. Facing declining relevance in detective work and labor espionage, the agency reinvented itself. In the 1920s and beyond, it offered asset protection, uniformed guard services, and corporate fraud investigations. By the 1960s, the term detective was dropped from the company's branding, and it simply became Pinkerton. The shift signaled a move toward risk management and corporate security rather than privatized sleuthing. This strategy proved effective. By 1995, yes, like 30 years ago, the agency employed 50,000 people across 250 offices worldwide. It was no longer a gun-toting detective bureau, but a modern security firm providing services such as guarding office buildings, investigating insurance claims, and consulting on espionage countermeasures. In 1999, the Swedish security conglomerate, Securitas AB, acquired the Pinkerton agency for approximately $384 million. Integration into a multinational corporation completed the transformation from a frontier detective service into a global security provider. The Pinkerton name remained, but its function and public image were vastly different from the days of Allen and Robert. Even after its transformation, the Pinkerton name carries weight. For labor organizers and union members, it remains a symbol of strike-breaking and corporate oppression. The historical memory of Pinkerton agents firing into crowds and infiltrating unions resonates in contemporary struggles over workers' rights. In some circles, Pinkerton is still used as a nickname for any heavy-handed corporate security. When reports emerged in 2020 that Amazon hired Pinkerton operatives to spy on warehouse workers in Spain, the reaction was swift outrage. That's right, kids. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Amazon, 2020, a few years ago, hiring Pinkertons to spy on workers? Sounds like it came out of some futuristic, dystopian Blade Runner sci-fi world, but it's the one we're living in. for better or worse. Although today Pinkertons operate with legal frameworks and presumably without the use of gunboats or cannons, presumably, the idea that private agencies monitor workers' organizing efforts is a reminder of a long history of conflict. And the underlying methodology of Pinkerton's earlier days still resonates with modern law enforcement. When the FBI was created in 1908, it absorbed Allen's innovations like centralized records and interagency communication. But it may have inherited some of the agency's tactics as well. In the post-9/11 era, the Bureau dispatched informants into Muslim communities, sometimes devising fake plots and supplying targets before swooping in to make arrests. Critics say these sting operations, which were championed as, quote, forward-leaning, preventative prosecutions to ostensibly prevent terrorism, blurred the line between surveillance and provocation, ensnaring people who might never have acted without government encouragement. That this occurred during a time of paranoia and hostility towards Islam-practicing Americans was not lost on many. And if we're just talking about a list of post-Pinkerton federal entrapment, then the list is nearly endless. The same questions arose in 2020, when federal prosecutors announced a plot to kidnap Democrat Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer at the hands of right-wing extremists, weeks before the presidential election. Headlines proclaimed this was evidence that right-leaning politics gave way to violent extremism. But it soon became clear that such a plot would never have been planned without the FBI's direct involvement. Of the 26 or so men who participated, at least 12 were FBI informants, some of whom took the lead and pushed others into moving forward with it. From just these two examples, with many more almost certainly in existence, it's clear that the clandestine methods pioneered against the Molly Maguires remains alive today, and the debate over whether they protect the public or undermine justice continues regardless of what political faction is in the crosshair. The Pinkerton story also endures in popular culture. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle drew inspiration from James McParlane's infiltration of the Molly Maguires when writing one of the Sherlock Holmes novels, The Valley of Fear. The unblinking eye logo has become an icon of private detection and espionage, appearing on t-shirts and even in the branding of fictional detective agencies. Not to mention that the term private eye comes directly from this logo and this motto. The dichotomy between myth and reality persists to this day. On one hand, Pinkertons are portrayed as tireless defenders of order, and on the other, they're seen as embodiments of ruthless corporate power. This duality ensures that the agency's legacy remains contested and, one can't deny, fascinating. Institutions often evolve in unexpected ways. Alan Pinkerton fled political repression in Scotland, helped fugitives in the Underground Railroad, and built a detective agency that promised to uphold justice. Yet by the late 1800s, his agency was suppressing labor movements and serving corporate interests that exploited the very workers he might have once championed. This inversion shows how goals can shift as organizations grow, and often diverge from the original intent, especially as they gain power. As it's often said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Oh, there's that saying about intentions and paving roads. It leads to hell, which isn't a good place at all. Allen's tale also illustrates the dangers of privatizing coercive power. The eventual passage of the Anti-Pinkerton Act shows a recognition that private forces should not wield unchecked authority. Yet the persistence of corporate and government surveillance shows that the tension between public oversight, private security, and rule of law remains unresolved today. In contemporary debates about privatized policing, from gated communities to corporate data collectors, the Pinkerton example offers cautionary lessons about accountability and the potential for abuse. Today, many of the rights that workers enjoy, such as the 8-hour workday, collective bargaining, and workplace safety regulations, are taken for granted. These rights were won through struggles that often involved violence and suffering from all sides. The Pinkertons were major players in those conflicts, sometimes obstructing progress and sometimes, inadvertently, accelerating it by provoking backlash. Recognizing this history brings appreciation for the fragile gains of past generations. And when we learn that Amazon's contract with the Pinkertons and the strategy of modern intelligence agencies echoes tactics from over a century ago, it becomes clear that the past is never truly past. Indeed, the eye of the Pinkerton logo remains unblinking, fulfilling its promise that the agency would never sleep. That is the controversial yet fascinating history of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I think this is a fascinating thing to look into. I mean, we've all heard about the Pinkertons, at least if you're familiar with any Old West story or like early 1900s spy narrative. We know they're popular, but a lot of us don't know how they became so popular. And growing up in Appalachia, coal mining towns, I obviously have some bias against them. You know, a lot of friends and family members have stories of their grandparents getting shot at by the Pinkertons or some private detective company. But even looking at it objectively, I think it's pretty clear why the country as a whole turned away from them. Now, did we turn away from things like entrapment and use of force and coercion? You know, who's to say, really? But I think it's a fascinating history and one that should not be forgotten, and I appreciate you sticking around to hear about it, and above all else, thank you for watching. Let us know in the comments if you enjoyed these historical deep dives. I certainly do, but maybe you're tired of hearing about it. But if there's a story that interests you, we can probably find out something about it. So let us know. New videos here Mondays at noon. Again, you can check out the new channel Wendiglitch and the OG channel Wendigoon in the description. Everyone who made this video possible will be credited in the description. Be sure to show them some love. And I believe that should do it for now, but before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! It was also just cooler when you were getting chased by Pinkertons, right? Because it's like, oh, I'm being tracked by the FBI, I'm being tracked by the police. But if you're being tracked by the Pinkertons, well, now it sounds like there's some like powerful family or dynasty who wants you dead. And that makes you sound a lot cooler than just a guy who counterfeited some money at an Old West like horse depot or whatever. It was a time to be alive.